So thirds in timing and timing charts is essentially the idea of it's basically ease in and out, but thinking of it in a different way. And in 2D, this is very important because when you're drawing, so you have a character here and they're going to end up here, where do you put your breakdown? And where you put your breakdown is very important because unlike CG, where the computer will handle things for you and kind of put it exactly where you want it to be, when you're dealing with a complex character that's wearing suits of armor and like all sorts of complex things, it's hard to just go put the pose here, put the pose there, and draw everything where it needs to be. Having kind of a rule set to follow makes it a lot easier. So for example, putting something in the middle is a lot easier than just arbitrarily slightly off middle, if that makes sense. So the idea of thirds is to solve an issue with halves. So halves is if you take your start and end position. So we're going to just do this. Start and end right there. Now, if I break this down in half, we now have this breakdown right in the middle. Okay, cool. Let's break it down some more. We break it down in half and half again, like so. And if I keep doing this, I can now ease in. So you can see that's ease out, fast, ease in. And I just did half, 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 half. Like that. Great. But there's a problem with halves. And that is that even though this is an ease in, or sorry, an ease out, and then that's an ease in, if you actually look at the spacing, this one here and this one here are the exact same thing. They're the hiccups. Gotta take a breath, make sure I don't get hiccups. I don't know why talking on dailies and stuff always gives me hiccups. So as it comes through here, that's spacing is the same thing. So what you get is not an ease in, but a slowdown that then becomes linear. If we were to look at it in the graph editor, it's essentially this flat line. It goes there and then like that. That's not an ease in. That's just linear motion right there. So it makes things feel stiff and typically a little bit flat. So thirds is instead of putting things in the middle, you put them on thirds. So for example, I could put a pose here. Okay. And then I'll put a pose here and then here like that. And then let's do this and then this. So now if we look at this, I just broke it down on thirds. So this is a third right there. And we don't have any of those spaces that are exactly the same. Now this is smaller. It gets bigger, really big, slightly smaller, smaller, smallest right there. And it makes it so that you don't get those boring spacings in there. And you can kind of mix and match. So for example, I could do a half right here and then thirds like this. And we still get that nice ease in, ease out. That's more interesting than doing halves. I hope that makes sense. So like these are the same. And then these are the same right there. Whereas here, nothing is the same. So that's the idea of thirds. Now, how do you apply that in animation? Well, it's essentially kind of the same principle. We are looking at our curves and trying to make sure that something isn't happening at a halfway point. Now, it's kind of hard to show with a bouncing ball here, but when we get to the Taylor assignment, I should be able to show that. It's essentially looking at your graph editor, and let's see if I can show it here. Let's take a look at, we'll just take this beginning curve here, and I'm just going to reset it right there. So if we take a look at this curve, it's the same thing going in and then going out. If I was to split this in the middle, right here, you'll notice that that curve is almost a mirror image going in and then out. If I break this down even more, just with keys, I'm not changing the curve, you'll notice that that is still almost halfway. If we just set this in step mode, it might make it a little bit easier to see. So see how these steps are kind of feeling similar. And if I was to push this even more, let's actually add one more key in here. And put in step mode. So halves would be if your animation started looking like this. So it's still technically easing in and out, but there we go. But see how it's kind of getting flatter there? It's not actually easing. So what we can do is we can just make sure that that favors one side more than the other. Now, like I said before, we don't usually encounter this in CG as much because the computer is very good at kind of giving us these transitions and in-betweens. But we can still apply the idea of it. So for example, here, instead of having this curve right in the middle, I could just push that up to favor the top key. And that's just going to make my curve more dynamic. When I put a breakdown here, I can favor this a little bit lower. That helps make it more dynamic. So I'm favoring one side of the curve more than the other, or one key more than the other. It's all the same terminology, or all different ways of explaining the same thing. So I hope all of that makes sense. It's essentially trying to avoid the halfway points, because the halfway points tend to lead to boring animation if we over rely on it. Animation typically looks more dynamic if we favor one side more than the other, or in the 2D terms, if we do thirds. Doesn't mean we always have to do it, but it just tends to make things more dynamic.